Labrīt, good morning. Thank you very much, Jāni, for the introductory words. February 24th, the world changed. Probably no one in this room, everyone in this room would want to say, oh, I knew it was going to happen. But in reality, I think we all could not inside believe that it actually was going to happen. That a country in Europe could openly attack and try to liquidate a peaceful neighbor, Russia, moving into Ukraine. But that is the reality. And as the main thesis, I think that there's one thing that we all need to put inside our minds to help us focus all of our combined efforts. And that is that in order for there to be peace and security in Europe, and in fact the world, Russia has to lose this war. Ukraine has to win. That is the only way that we can return to a world of peace and security. Anything else would simply mean that Russia, if they do not lose this war or perceive that they have lost this war, this will simply be another step in an unknown road. We've seen this step starting years back. Georgia. What happened after Georgia? A attempted reset at relations with Russia. Then in 2014, the occupation and legal annexation of Crimea and a war in the Donbass. And still there was widespread belief in the West that if only we found the right words to use with Putin, he would understand that we are actually not in the business of wanting to attack him, and he would relent. And there are two completely different worlds that we live in. That in the West, NATO as a whole, and that which is emanating out of Moscow. I think you'll be talking a lot about that. Now, how are we going to make sure that Putin loses the war? There are three fronts that we're working on. The first, obviously, is the military, then there's the economic, and then there is the informational space. So, militarily speaking, we're supporting Ukraine so that Ukraine can defend itself and work and fight against the occupying power of Russia. My own country, together with Estonia, we are absolute leaders in terms of amount of money compared to a GDP. We're somewhere coming up to about 250 million. That's about 1/3 of our defense budget that we are devoting to Ukraine. That's coming close to 1% of GDP. We understand this as a Baltic nation, that this war that Ukraine is fighting is our war as well. But we're convinced it's not only the Baltics, it's all of Europe and all of the West that is interested. So we have to keep up the military support for Ukraine. Economically speaking, we have to starve Moscow of funds to feed its war machine. And this is done through sanctions. We've now gone through 5 sanction iterations in Europe. We're working on number 6. But the main gist of the sanctions has to be the energy sector. Coal, oil, and gas. The main income for the Kremlin is energy exports. So we stop importing these goods, money stops flowing to the Kremlin. It's that simple. We have agreed on coal. We're now currently in rather difficult negotiations on oil and gas. I'm convinced that we have to do this. Otherwise, we are working against ourselves. I'll speak a little bit more about that later. And then we have, I think, the topic of this conference, the informational space. So Mr. Sarts mentioned that there is a different world that Russia is living in. I think it's often referred to as the Russian world. They've created a belief system which is complete in and of itself and based 100% on lies and false assumptions. One of these is that Ukraine is led by Nazis, which is completely absurd. And then considering that Zelensky is Jewish, is perverse and not only absurd. But it's a claim that they're making, that Ukraine must be denazified. And remember, Russia is continuing the old Soviet mantra that our enemies are Nazis, so if it's an enemy, by definition, it's a Nazi. The second is that NATO is a threat, when actually it's the complete opposite. My country joined NATO because we felt threatened by Russia, and we petitioned NATO to take us into the club, not to wage war, but to avoid war through collective defense. NATO is not encroaching. It's not encroaching on Sweden and Finland, but Sweden and Finland realize that the security situation has changed and now want to join this powerful defensive alliance. But the myth being told is that NATO is somehow posing a threat, where NATO is created just because of the factual threat from Russia itself. Then there's a myth that the West is escalating the war by providing arms to Ukraine. I'm pausing because you have to think about how absurd that claim is. We are escalating the war. Hello, who is attacking Ukraine? I don't recall that there are Latvian soldiers fighting in the Donbass trying to squash the Ukrainian fighters, or Germans, or French, or Americans. It's the Russians who are attacking. And to help someone who is being attacked is not escalation, it's common sense. So by providing arms to Ukraine, we are not escalating anything. The only escalation is and can come from Russia itself, the very obvious aggressor here. But this is a story, a narrative that is trying to, that Russia is trying to put out, and it's an outright lie, and we have to acknowledge that. Then there's the myth, and this goes back a few centuries in Russia, in Moscow, that Ukraine does not even exist. It's not a country, they're not a people, they don't have a culture, and God forbid it's not a language. It's just a poor version of Russian, which is the only true, I suppose, Slavic language, which is completely absurd. Ukraine is a nation, has a history, and has a language and culture. But this is the thinking that goes back to at least Catherine the Great, where you have Great Russia, you have White Russia, Belarus, and you have Little Russia, Ukraine. But we have to understand that in Russia, they're living in the world where this is perceived as truth, but it's not truth, it's false. And finally, deriving from all of that Russia somehow has a right to Ukraine, because at one point, Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire. Well, by this logic, I suppose Great Britain has a right to Ireland. I suppose Germany has a right to Alsace. I suppose Sweden or Denmark has a right to parts of Sweden, and Sweden has parts of the right to parts of northern Germany and Poland, hell, the Baltics for that matter. You understand, this way of thinking, I think Yanis Sarts is right, it's anachronistic, imperialistic thinking. But Russia is stating this narrative. It's not just a story, it's actually the way that they're thinking. And that's the threat that we have to understand. So what can we do? First of all, we have to acknowledge that Russia really is a long-term threat to peace and security in Europe and to peace and security in the world. And then we have to strengthen our defenses. And again, it's these same three defenses. First of all, obviously, militarily. NATO is in the process of strengthening the eastern flank from the Baltic down through the Black Sea. This is a very correct thing to do, but I want to highlight that NATO also has to rethink its defensive strategy for the three Baltic countries. When the EFP was set up some 5 years ago, the strategy was called a tripwire strategy. With the idea, you put some boots on the ground from various NATO forces. If Russia comes in, well, we lose some territory, but then NATO regroups with its overwhelming force and firepower and regains the territory. But if we look at the reality of how Russia still wages war, and we can look in Ukraine, we have a town near Kiev called Bucha, which has been liberated of the Russian occupation. And what do we see? What does the Russian army do once it conquers territory? It doesn't just conquer territory and destroy infrastructure. It rapes women, it tortures people, it kills people, and it deports people. It's the same story that I recently read an account of the Tsar Peter I's occupation of Tartu, as it's called, in I don't remember the date when they fell, 1708, 1707, a little bit before Riga. At the end of this occupation, the historians will correct me, but I read that there were some 315 Estonians left alive. Everyone else was killed, deported, and the town was completely destroyed. 1720, 2020. 300 years, nothing has changed. This is a sad reality that we have to open up our eyes to, and we have to have a deterrence in the Baltics, which does not allow history to repeat itself, but is robust enough that Russia would never dream of even making the attempt, because they would lose from the very beginning. Second, energy security. As I said, in the economy, it's sanctioning Russia's energy sector, which is important. The converse side of that coin is we have to strengthen our collective energy independence. We are overly dependent in Europe on Russian energy. So diversify away to other sources, LNG for gas, other sources of oil, and move faster in renewable resource development. Wind, solar, hydro, biomass. Move away from being in any way dependent, because that dependency can and will be used as blackmail against any and all of us. We're seeing it today. And finally, in the info space, again, the main topic here. The first is shut down the channels of propaganda in the West. My country has shut down over 60 various Russian propaganda channels in the television sphere, and over 110 internet sites have been taken down, and as new ones pop up, we take them down as well. Because this narrative of lies, which Russia propagates within its own population, they're attempting to propagate that also outside of their country, and also especially targeting Russian speakers. And since the Soviet Union collapsed, there are millions of Russian speakers living all throughout Europe. And many of them still like to get their news from Russia. It's very understandable from an individual point of view. It's our responsibility to cut off the lies and propaganda coming to them, because those same people can come back and cause problems for our own governments. The second is to work on getting out the truth in the Russian language. So in Russia itself, I don't think I need to speak much about how the press is being oppressed, but we here in Latvia are harboring a growing number of Russian journalists from the Russian Free Press. And for example, the BBC Russian feed is now based in Latvia. The Deutsche Welle Russian feed is now based in Latvia. Not Echo Moskvy, there are various journalists from that, but Novaya Gazeta is now based in Latvia, and Meduza, others as well. It's helping to get objective information in Russian, both to the population within Russia and to the Russian-speaking peoples in Europe and in the rest of the Western and the free world. So I want to sum up now, and you can continue with your conference. Sorry, it's one of the few perks of being Prime Minister. what's important is for us to realize that as Western countries, as NATO member states, we need not be afraid of our own strength and power. We need to develop that strength and power and stay united, because when we are united, we are, without question, the strongest force in the world. A force for good, a force for freedom, democracy, and the rule of law, not the rule of force. Let's stick together. Combined with the combined forces, we will succeed in our mission. Thank you very much.